Now that we have a good understanding of the Active Directory services and how AD Connect works, let's take a minute now to just look at the design decisions associated with authentication. And let's have a very quick review of the cloud authentication options first of all. Well, you have cloud only, which means if you exist completely in Azure and perhaps you don't have any on-premises infrastructure to worry about, you could completely start with Azure AD, but most of your questions are going to focus more around what do you do in a hybrid identity scenario where you have on-premises as well. And for on-premises, you have a couple of options in the cloud authentication mechanism. You have the password hash sync plus seamless SSO or pass-through authentication plus seamless SSO. So password hash sync, so this is the simplest way to enable authentication for your on-premises directory objects in Azure AD because the users can use the same username and password that they use on premises without having to deploy any additional infrastructure. Some premium features of Azure AD like identity protection do actually require the password hash sync no matter which authentication method you use. So even if you do use pass-through authentication, but you want to turn on things like identity protection, you do need to have password hash sync. Then we have pass-through authentication. So this is a simple password validation for Azure AD authentications, but it uses a software agent that runs on premises. And so at sign-in, your authentication is passed through to that agent, which in turn, validates, with your domain controller. So the validation doesn't happen in the cloud here. It actually happens, on premises. In addition, you also have your federated authentication option. So when you choose, this method, Azure AD hands off the entire authentication process to a trusted, separate authentication system such as on-premises AD Federation services, and they will validate the user's password. And this can provide, a lot of additional advanced authentication requirements, smart cards, things like that are examples there. And it could be, again, ADFS or third-party providers. But let's take a look at hybrid identity with password hash sync in a little bit more detail first of all. Well, essentially what you can see here is that, a user's coming in and wants application access, maybe to a SaaS application, maybe to one of the Azure services, where RBAC controls are applied. And so they basically need to authenticate with Azure AD. So the user goes ahead, says, hey, I want to sign in. And that authentication happens, right away, in the cloud itself. So the user can sign in and authenticate right there. The way that happens, though, is that periodically, every 2 minutes, the Azure AD Connect agent is doing a directory query with Active Directory, and it syncs up those password hashes for the identity up to Azure AD, and that's how the authentication can happen completely in the cloud. Now, if we look at this in a little bit more detail, we have some considerations here. So the effort, this is the least effort required out of the two options between password hash and pass-through authentication. It's part of the AD Connect sync process, as I mentioned, that runs every 2 minutes. So very easy to set up. You just have to install AD Connect and you're basically good to go. From a user experience, you can deploy seamless SSO, eliminating any unnecessary prompts after the user signs in, so they can just sign in once and then they're authenticated with all of the Azure AD services that are associated with that account. And then from a business continuity aspect, this is great too because this is highly scalable as the cloud service itself scales with Microsoft Data Center. So Azure AD is highly available by design. You can rely on Microsoft's SLAs there. You can, if you want to, though, deploy an additional AD Connect server in staging mode in a standby configuration. So in the event something goes wrong with that AD Connect server, you could quickly get another one up, but not critical. You're still going to be online while you get that machine up and running. From a consideration perspective, though, the only thing is there's no immediate enforcement, in on-premises account state changes. So you can consider if you're doing a bulk set of updates on premises and maybe you're disabling a whole set of users, maybe just do an immediate sync after that to make sure everything gets synced up successfully. So, Azure AD is aware of that. Then we move on to pass-through authentication. So it works a little bit differently. The user still goes in, and signs in from their perspective. It feels the same, but what actually happens though is it passes the authentication through to these authentication agents that run on premises and have to be connected to your Azure, your Active Directory domain controller itself. So they need no boundaries with their network access. They need to be able to connect to AD on premises whenever they need to. The identity is still synced, so Azure AD Connect is doing that identity sync and does the directory queries to do that. But when we actually do the authentication itself, that is passed through. Now, naturally, there are some considerations here. From an effort perspective, you do need one or more agents installed on existing servers, and it's recommended that you have 3 to make sure from a business continuity perspective you're okay, but there is an effort to installing and maintaining those. You must have access to on-premises AD controllers, and those agent servers need outbound internet access. So make sure that you consider the security implications of pass-through authentication on those agent servers that need to run, and you don't just put them out in a DMZ or something like that. In addition, from a user experience, same as the other authentication, deploy seamless SSO, and it's going to feel great for the users. Business continuity, just mentioned, you recommend to deploy those 2 extra pass-through agents for redundancy. Now you can also deploy password hash sync as a backup method. So even if you want to mainly focus on doing pass-through authentication, maybe you've got some requirements on that, you want to enforce some policies or things perhaps on premises immediately and, have that take effect as soon as they sign in. That's one of the considerations, because pass-through authentication enforces on-premises account policy at the time of sign-in, but you could deploy password hash sync as a backup method as well. And then last but not least, we have that Azure AD hybrid identity with federated authentication. So again, the user's still going to go into AD, but they're going to get redirected. And when they get redirected, they hit a federation proxy, which runs typically in a perimeter. So if you're using ADFS as your federation service, you'll have federation proxies that run in the perimeter, and then on premises, you have your ADFS servers. ADFS is what's basically checking in with AD and saying, hey, let me do the authentication check here. It's basically checking those identities and passwords and making sure everything's good. But Azure AD Connect, same thing still. Still going to have it run in. It'll do a directory query to AD to make sure those identities are synced up, so everything knows about each other. But this is, again, you might go over to a third party to actually, do that sign in and authentication, and, you can customize pages and sign in pages and things like that as well. With that, how do we begin choosing between all of these, different authentication methods? And Microsoft kindly provides this diagram, and we'll start from the top and go through a few scenarios here. So first of all, do you want Azure AD to handle sign-in completely in the cloud? So first of all, if the answer is no to that, then you've got to decide do I want to integrate with an existing federation provider? If I do, then I'm basically going to be down the federation, methodologies on the right-hand side. If the answer to, do I want Azure AD to handle signing completely in the cloud is yes, then I've got to decide, am I able to get all the security policies I need? So do I want to enforce user level Active Directory security policies during signing? Well, those policies come from on-premises. So as soon as I choose that option, I go to the right, and now I come down the tree that's going to hit pass-through authentication plus seamless SSO, or password authentication plus seamless SSO with password hash sync. Now, why are both of those there? You might ask, well, if you want to use identity protection, one of the services in the P2 license, which is checking for leaked credentials out in the dark web, you do need that because Microsoft needs to be able to look at those credentials in order to basically scan for them. So that's essentially what that particular option is there. Now, on the left-hand side, again, if we go back, do you want to enforce user-level Active Directory security policies? If the answer is no, then I have to decide do I have a sign-in requirement not natively supported by Azure AD? Well, as long as the answer is no, I really should go password hash sync plus seamless SSO. Simplest method, easiest one to install. I install my AD Connect, I choose password hash sync, and that's the route I go. If I do have some sign-in requirement not natively supported, then I do have to sort of look at the federation options. And then again, the question, whenever I want to determine if I need to use password hash sync even with federation, you can see again, do you want sign-in, disaster recovery, or leaked credential reports? And it's those leaked credential reports where Microsoft has to scan for you, and using that identity protection service, they can let you know if your users have been compromised, and that just requires that password hash sync. So that's the thing to look for all the time. If you want identity protection, you're going to need password hash sync. If you have certain customizable requirements that are not natively supported, you're probably going to be looking at federation. If you want to enforce on-premises policies that you have in your Active Directory that aren't in Azure AD, you'll probably just go through pass-through authentication, and then you can use those on-premises policies. And ideally, if you can just keep it simple, just go with password hash sync plus seamless SSO. But this is a big decision. It's really, really important because it's a decision that you will make that is very hard to change later on. It affects the way the users log in and all the services they have available. So it's important to try to really think through this, and I can guarantee you will get questions around choosing these methods on the exam itself.